So, thank you. So we're here to discuss big issues tonight, things like feeding the world, how to raise incomes, maybe how to do both at the same time. But they're issues I think our panelists have grappled with for a long time and are intimately familiar with. And I think that the first thing we want to talk about, if I can get this to, doesn't like me, maybe I'll turn this. Can you all hear me anyway? Yeah. Okay. So I think the first issue is that we want to get to is how do we imagine or even define a sustainable agriculture? And I see it as food production that ensures productive resources for future generations. Healthy soil, adequate water, healthy ecosystems, and also livelihoods for people. And secondly, how do you do that in a way that lifts people out of poverty and gives them a sustainable livelihood? This is not only a crucial issue for the quality of life, but also for population. If you consider that we know that rising incomes correlate with reduced population growth. Currently, we have about 2.6 billion farmers around the world, and about a third of them rank as malnourished. So they're food producers that don't produce enough food for themselves. So food, agriculture, equity, sustainability, all these issues are intertwined. And there's much to be concerned about. Economists talk about external costs of the way we produce food, but there are also issues like climate change, food price gyrations, and the health impacts of what we do. There's an interesting book that just came out, and I'm just going to give it a plug because it's just been engrossing to me, and that's Tomato Land, which looks at these issues just in Florida in the tomato production system. And we have a lot of debates about, whether chemicals are toxic or not, or the costs of various production systems. But it gives a very interesting on-the-ground view of what it means in the real world to make certain choices about how we produce food. So I think what we're also going to get into is how we can imagine a different future. How do you get sustainable agriculture? How does it intertwine with the green economy? And even produce economic growth, maybe in a way that satisfies Coca-Cola stockholders, as well as provide water resources to poor nations. How do you get rising food production and yet ensure biodiversity? And what's the importance of biodiversity to health? What's the role of organic agriculture, and how does it mix or interact with more conventional methods? And I think we also want to get into what the role of policy is and institutions in producing this change. So, to discuss these issues, we have an esteemed panel. And I'll start with introducing Hans Herren, who's the president of the Millennium Institute. He's this second fellow here. And he's an internationally recognized scientist and development expert, and he's perhaps best known for having designed and implemented one of the largest and most successful biological control programs against an insect pest in Africa that averted a famine. He serves on numerous boards and co-chaired the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology, which I hope he will no doubt elaborate on, because I think some of the audience are probably not familiar with it. And in 1995 he won the World Food Prize for his work in it. Next to me we have Catherine DiMattia, who's the president of the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements. And this is kind of an international federation of organic bodies all around the world. She comes, I actually know her from she was executive director of the Organic Trade Association from 1990 to 2006. And during the last couple of years, she was an important source for the book I wrote called Organic Egg. So, and she's been on the board of IFOAM since 2006. Next to Hans, we have Ernesto Robelli from the Coca-Cola Company. He's the Senior Manager of Sustainable Agriculture in the Environment and Water Resources Department of Coke. And in this role, he spearheads a number of sustainable agricultural initiatives, including the development of the sustainable sourcing strategy and the establishment of international pilot projects. So I was sort of curious about this because we don't often think of Coke in agriculture, but we think of it as a drink company, so I'm sort of curious about what his role and work is there. He's also an active player in Coca-Cola's global partnership with the World Wildlife Fund. So, and finally we have Dr. Eric Shibian. He's the founder and director of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at Harvard Medical School. And in 1980, he co-founded the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which went on to win the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. In 1996, he founded the Center for Health and Global Environment at the Harvard Medical School, and it's the first center at a medical school in the United States focusing on human health dimensions of global environmental change. And he's the author most recently, co-author most recently of Sustaining Life, How Human Health Depends on Biodiversity. So, and he will elaborate on those issues for us. So I think maybe we should start by getting Hans to kind of frame the issue and discuss, what are the, and this is something that came out of the ISTAT report. What are the problems with our current agriculture, and what is a future vision that we can imagine, or that your group put forward?
Well, thank you, Sam, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to be here tonight and having quite a number of people here for this special panel. Yeah, so agriculture. I think we're in a bind with it, and as many of you know, and because we have a number of issues to deal with, a few years ago, actually almost 9 years ago now, at the Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, it was decided that one should have an assessment of agricultural knowledge, science and technology for development. Finding out exactly where are we in agriculture today, and why are we in the situation we are today. So looking 50 years back, what brought us to the situation we are sitting in, and what should we do actually looking forward 50 years in order to get out of it and to come to a food system, not only agriculture but the whole food system, which would resolve a lot of the issues which had been identified in by many different groups, but never really brought together into one document. So the document, and I saw a lot of people took the reports there. So we have written 2,000 pages of 4 years, 400 people, and basically summarized the key issues in agriculture and food systems, and also prepared a number, or come up with a number of options for action. Because of the way the whole thing was mounted, we could not really make recommendations because governments don't like to be given recommendations because they have to act on it. And so we ended up to offer options for action under different circumstances for different regions of the world. So what can you do to get out of where we are in terms of policies in agricultural knowledge, science and technology to move forward? And what is the problematic? I think the problematic really is that we have a food system which is broken. We have an agricultural system which uses more calories than it produces. So something wrong there, because isn't the sun helping us actually to do a lot create a lot of calories? So how can we actually move forward with a system which destroys its own ground on basis, which is the soil and the biodiversity actually needs to move forward. Again, as I said, it uses more energy than it produces, contributes therefore to climate change, which then in turn affected very strongly, so actually putting us even further down into a problem. We also have a food system where, despite all the research and the results of the green evolution, live almost 1 billion people which are under and malnourished. Poverty remains a big issue, so there's nexus poverty and hunger. We have growing inequities between urbans and rural, and even within rural areas. And we have a tremendous health problem. So we have actually a food system which is creating health issues everywhere, not only in the north but in the south, for different reasons, but we have a mounting issue there. Many governments can hardly pay those bills anymore, and a lot of studies have been done, and you can actually trace it back to the way we nourish ourselves. Again, and all this creating an environment where it becomes more and more difficult to produce the food we need to produce, not only today, but in the years to come. One of the issues also is that actually today, although we have about 7 billion people, we produce in the average 4,600 kilocalories per person. So there's plenty to go around with, right? The problem is that 1,200 of these calories are fed to animals for meat, so which we overconsume, just as an example, and we waste a huge amount of what is produced too. About 1/3 overall is wasted, and really wasted. It's not, most of it is actually not even recycled as compost and goes back onto the land, but it ends up in some rubbish heaps, or eventually goes down into the oceans. So we have this problem with that food system which needs to be tackled from many different angles. And so that's what actually the report comes up with, a number of solutions, and one of it was really saying that we need to move into a more an agricultural system which takes into account the multifunctionality of agriculture, so that we do produce food, but at the same time we have to maintain the ecosystem services. We have to make sure that our food system promotes health, on the one hand human health, environmental health, and also an economic health. So I think this new way of looking at agriculture, which actually will resolve problems rather than create many new ones as it has done in the past. Now we also have to recognize, and we did in the report, never mind what some people thought, that we did not actually recognize the positive impact of agri-research in the past. So again, it did a lot of good, because we probably would have a whole lot more people which are under and malnourished if we didn't have agri-research. I mean, that's true. But I think we have to recognize also the downside and learn from those lessons as we move forward into an agriculture, again, which is multifunctional, which is based on the understanding of the ecosystem in which it is happening. So that an agriculture which is in harmony, in tune with our environment, so to make it sustainable. So because the more we work against it, the more difficult it is, the more energy we have to use, right, to overcome the system which goes against sort of the nature. And I think as we work more with the natural system, the more health we get and the less energy we'll have to use as we go on. We also need to think about the whole issue of employment. You know, we're going to have around 3 billion more people. But that's not the more people we actually also will have to nourish one way or another. From the calorie point of view, we actually don't have enough. And the problem is, you know, where are these grown? What is it actually which we grow? And who does grow it? On what conditions? So there's a lot of questions there which we came up with, a number of solutions as we move forward. But One, I think, issue as we look forward now is what are we going to do also with this many more people? We already have 1.5 billion who have more jobs. And so if we go to an agricultural model, sort of the industrial type, which uses less and less people, but more and more energy, which is a finite quantity, is that the way forward? So how can we then also develop an agricultural system where more people can be employed in a rewarding way, not in a back-breaking way only, but in something which is rewarding, where people actually want to go into. So then came really sort of the issue of how can we make the farmer's job, again, you know, a job where people want to get into, a respectable job, so that the young people also want to choose. And so again, there we have come up with a number of suggestions how to move forward, and that is really promoting more of the small farms, family farms, promoting more, again, agroecological solutions, where we have to use less external inputs and produce more of the inputs needed to fertilize the soil on the soil using cropping systems, which we knew from the past we have abandoned because of energy was cheap, right? And people wanted rather do something else than be on the farm. But I think as we look forward, I think we have to reconsider many of these aspects of agriculture and food systems and try to fix broken pieces of the food system.
Right. And Dr. Shibian, I wonder if you could elaborate on that, because your work seems to be on the health implications of the choices we made, at least in the loss of biodiversity. I wonder if your work can dovetail with some of the things that Alonso said.
Well, I first should say that this is the perfect day for us to be meeting. 2,300 years ago in Alexandria, Egypt, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth based on the angle of the sun in Alexandria, and he was off by only 80 kilometers. So we have a hard act to follow. But I hope similar insights will occur with all of us today. He also calculated the angle that the Earth was tilted, and he got that exactly. So, as I say, this is a good day for us to be meeting. My interest has largely been on what are the health impacts of the loss of biological diversity. And I'm also, which was not mentioned, I'm a farmer. I've run a farm called Paradisa Farm, which is the old Persian word for paradise. In central Massachusetts, I grow apples, peaches, pears, plums, Asian pears, apricots, cherries, and grapes as organically as I can. That's an important issue for us to follow up.
You didn't bring them?
Nothing's ready. I usually do, but it's too early. And I have been very interested in the issue of organic agriculture, and in particular, some of the changes that many of you are quite aware of what are happening to various groups of organisms in this country and around the world. You have followed, for example, the rapid decline of many amphibian species, again in this country and around the world. Some 1/3 of the 6,600 known amphibians are at risk of extinction. This has never occurred to anyone's calculations in the 250 million years that amphibians have been on Earth and have withstood all the major extinction events. You probably also know that bats are starting to die in their caves. Their hibernacula started in upstate New York in 2006 in Howe's Cavern. Those deaths have started moving south and west. Sometimes these caves, 100% of the bats died. To everyone's knowledge, that is an unprecedented event. 96% of the 4 most common species of bumblebee species in the United States are in major decline. Moth populations, butterfly populations, songbird populations are all in severe decline. Now, some of those reasons have to do with land use changes, some of them have to do with climate change, but there is increasing evidence, in my view, and in the literature, that some of them, if not many of them, have to do with our increasing use of various agricultural chemicals, including some that are long-lived in agro-ecosystems. As an example, bee colony collapse disorder has been strongly linked in research to chemicals, systemic pesticides called neonicotinoids that are in the plant tissue or in the plant juices, in what are called cutation droplets around the edges of leaves, or in pollen, or in the roots. These compounds, imidacloprid is one, are highly toxic, both neurotoxins and immunotoxins to bees. These have been banned in France, Slovenia, Italy, and Germany because of those impacts. There are others, atrazine, a major herbicide used in this country, which is highly toxic to amphibians, so toxic that rainwater concentrations in parts of the United States will cause endocrine and reproductive impacts on several species of amphibians. Atrazine is banned in the European Union, not in the United States. Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in this country, in the world, is also toxic to amphibians and may be toxic to us as well. It affects, in very low concentrations, 1/100th of the concentrations that are used or recommended for GM crop distribution. It affects an enzyme called aromatase, which is a major enzyme in the production of estrogens in our bodies. So there are human health impacts that are potential. There are environmental impacts from some of the chemicals we use. And yet, in spite of that, one of the things I spoke about in the previous panel was that organic farming is often not considered in the discussions about how are we going to deal with future food security. How are we going to deal with feeding 9 billion people? And there's several myths in my view. I'm sure our other panelist knows a lot more about this than I. But the myth of yields, that they produce lower yields. Many studies have shown that that's not true. The myth of there not being enough organic fertilizer that is available to supply organic farms. That relies on the assumption that that fertilizer will come from manure, from livestock. Therefore, one has to cut down forests and use other available land to produce that. Not talking about legume crops. The myth that there is no difference in terms of environmental and health impacts from organic to conventional to GM farming, and the myth that it cannot be scaled up. You can grow carrots and lettuce, etc., in your small gardens in your backyard, but you can never scale it up to several thousand-acre organic farms to feed the world. And there are many organic farms that are thousands of acres that are doing very well. Their yields are as good as their conventional neighbors under ideal conditions. Their yields are much greater than their conventional neighbors under drought conditions, and that leads to the other major point that I wanted to make here. We are facing, as you all know very well, climate change, which will increase. Even if we stop our greenhouse gas emissions right now, the half-life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is over 100 years. But we can reduce our emissions significantly and can slow down, not reverse, but slow down the warming of the Earth and the increased extreme weather events like drought and flooding and increased sea levels. And it's very important to recognize that organic soils are much more drought resistant. So this is going to be very important in coming years. And they are much more energy efficient. So when we're talking about reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases, this is very important to keep in mind. So what I'm mentioning is both primary health impacts from the way we practice agriculture, many of which are very, very hard to determine because human health impacts sometimes take decades to develop, and there are multiple variables. These chemicals are generally not studied in combination, and they're not studied on children. Children are assumed to be small adults. That is not true physiologically. They're much more vulnerable to disruptions in their biochemistry and physiology. But we do know some of the individual impacts, but there's very little long-term data about the long-term chronic low-level exposures to some of these chemicals. And as a physician, where the precautionary principle is part of medical practice, when a patient comes into the emergency room, you never have enough data before you have to make a decision about whether you operate or whether you start them on a medicine. You have to do that because the risk of waiting is often catastrophic. So my suggestion, and European Union and other countries have adopted this precautionary principle in their concern to ban chemicals that have demonstrated human health and environmental impacts that seem to be unacceptable, even though they are not 100% proven.
Good, thank you. We're going to kind of move into the more practical realm. I'm wondering, Ernesto, if you could address this, because you know, some of the problems are laid out, as well as what some of the panels, a couple of panels see as solutions. You're in sustainable agriculture and Coca-Cola. You're obviously trying to help, or presumably help move a corporation from point A to point B, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that process and what's important in defining what you want to do and getting there.
I'll be glad to. First of all, thanks for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to tell what we are doing within Coca-Cola. Sustainable, first of all, why is Coca-Cola involved in sustainable agriculture? It's a question that I get asked all the time. Well, when we just think about Coke, the beverage, we realize that there are natural flavors in it, of which nobody knows what they are, myself or any of you, and sugar, obviously, or different forms of sugar. And all those forms of sweeteners have natural origin. So the natural flavors plus the natural sweeteners make Coke, just like another food product, very reliant on agricultural products. Now that is our sparkling line, but we also, as you know, have a very diverse juice line, coffees and teas. So when you add those other ingredients or those other products to our portfolio, you realize that our agricultural presence is pretty large. So Coke has traditionally taken a very, intense view to sustainability and a very dedicated view to sustainability. It was the first company to do a life cycle analysis back in the 70s with a large amount of material packaging that's disposed of. So Coke has always had that understanding, and our biggest agenda in the sustainability spectrum is water. We have very ambitious goals around water. We also have programs around carbon and energy or emissions and energy and packaging. So the fourth pillar to be added to this very recently is sustainable agriculture, as of 2 or 3 years ago. So like I said, you now realize why. I mean, obviously we source agricultural materials, just like any other food or beverage company. And, you know, like you said in the introduction, part of our efforts have been focused on, I'd say, two different kind of spheres. One is more on the governance aspects, is understanding what we buy and telling our suppliers how we want them to meet Coca-Cola's regulations. So we have supplier guiding principles that every supplier that sells to the Coca-Cola system anywhere in the world needs to abide by. So if you are going to sell to Coke, you're going to have to sign those principles that are auditable. Beyond those, we're working to make those even stronger. They were developed more with a social understanding around, you know, prevention of child labor and things like that, and obviously following environmental regulations in the local countries where we source, but now we're taking that a step forward and we're going to develop our own agricultural guiding principles in the next year or two to come. So that is in the governance aspect. So besides that, we believe that, like some of the panelists have said, the sustainability answer nobody has a sustainability answer. I've been an agronomist all my life, and I know that we tend to look at, you know, agronomy just through one single lens, and it's a very multidisciplinary science, and we need the input from many others. So we believe in that is that we're working in the development of pilot projects worldwide. And we have, I'd say 7 probably active pilot projects in sugar, some of which have been awarded. You know, in Australia, for instance, we have one in minimizing the contamination of groundwater that is affected the Great Barrier Reef, and that's been awarded a national distinction in Australia. Some that are more related to juices. I'm working with Earth University, working, for instance, you mentioned fertilizers. We're working with natural microorganisms that can naturally fix nitrogen out of the air without the presence of legumes, because we know legumes are a common vehicle to carry this rhizobium of bacteria. So, bottom line, I think we're definitely making strides. It's not our most advanced field. I recognize that water is definitely much more advanced. But we are making very positive strides. We are members of SII, which I encourage you, the audience, to visit the site. It's a consortium of food companies that are really concerned about sustainable agriculture, founded by Nestle, Unilever, and Danone in Europe, and Coke joined shortly afterwards. We're very active in that organization, again, promoting and making sure that the practices by which that we recommend are really the ones that are getting better into our products. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's...
Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, are these just pilot projects, or I mean, do you envision really shifting Coke in terms of its sourcing practices and the practices of obviously the farmers who supply you?
Good point. I think the pilot projects are different scales. Some are very limited, and even some outside of our supply chain. I was working with a student from Oxford last year, and we did what we call an ex-situ pilot project, where we purposely did it outside of our supply chain, in view that we feel our orange growers in Costa Rica are going to migrate to that area, so we better prepare them ahead of time. So not everything needs to be done in the supply chain if you want to be proactive. Some are much more encompassing and dealing with a much higher amount of growers. But like when I mentioned the governance aspects is where we really specify, as prescriptive as we can be, because not all science is out, and given the volumes that we need to source for our product line, you know, what we believe should be the recommended approaches for COVID. We are also in the process of doing a self-assessment for growers to self-assess what the practices are. And, you know, in the sustainable agriculture sphere, there's a lot of parallel efforts in different crops. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, they are a little bit separated by commodities. There's an organization called Keystone out of Colorado, which Coca-Cola is a member of, that has put out one of the pioneer tools to determine what are your environmental impacts in terms of growing crops. Unfortunately, the organization is US-based, and the focus of the crops has been the 5 key crops in the United States, you know, wheat and corn. But being members of Keystone, We just have launched a pilot in Michigan where a great proportion of the corn using high fructose corn syrup is to track down the environmental impacts of growers using corn. So, to your point, I mean, we have a variety of initiatives. We have governance, but different initiatives around the different crops that we source.
And Catherine, I mean, if you could give us, you know, the organic perspective. I mean, you're involved in a global organization. Organic in the U.S., I think, often gets the rap that it's just, you know, expensive food for elitists. And, you know, I'm wondering if there's, you know, having kind of a wider view, a more global view, to see something else going on.
Well, I think my fellow panelists here have covered a number of, obviously, have painted a picture here of all the problems that we have. And organic agriculture has been debating these same issues for 70, 80, I know, maybe 100 years now. The International Federation itself started in 1970, when we came together as a group of academics and researchers and farmers and to talk about, well, what kind of system is going to honor the core principles that we care about, or that this group of people cared about, and that we in organic continue to care about. The principles of care, ecology, health, and fairness. And I think you heard that in some of the other statements that were made. That has always been the basis of making decisions about what is an organic system. And it is all about farming, because that's where organic started. It was about observing nature, natural systems, and saying, what are we doing as we farm to disrupt natural systems? Now, I guess if you could go way back, you would say farming is not natural. I mean, basically, right? Before we, people, were able to intellectualize the system of nature, we were at the mercy of nature. So we evolved to control it. And that has been the basis of the problem in agriculture, is that the solutions, the methodologies, the materials that have been developed have all been developed to control nature instead of to harmonize, to work with, to look at it as a holistic system. You can't say we're going to deal with an insect problem and not think about air, water, soil, and the plant itself. You can't say, well, we want to reduce pesticide use now that we've created so much pesticide use, and genetically engineer the pesticides into the crop itself. Well, the crop may be resistant to the pesticide or the herbicide, but what about the roots of the crop? What about the stalk of the crop? What about, you know, the resistance that is established in the environment? What are the next levels of impact? And that's one of the big challenges that ends up having people fight all the time about what the solutions are. Because I think there's a certain amount of honesty in all the discussions about what is sustainability and how do we get there. But it's not driven by political will. And as Hans, I don't know if you agree with me, what IFOAM has been, we've been working for many years as a recognized NGO of the United Nations. So we've been to a number of the committees, the convention meetings, the Committee for Sustainable Development, you know, the climate change. I mean, it's an endless amount of discussion that goes out in the world. But there's always a barrier to coming to a decision. And I'm sure the UN doesn't really have the political strength to do that, so they're always trying to balance things. But there's a lot of information out there already, and there's some excitement, and all this excitement could be dashed towards this Rio +20, the 20 years after the Rio agreements in '92. So next year, working up to that convention, there are a number of meetings, and people are trying to, and these committees are trying to say, all right, how can we build a holistic system that begins to solve some of these problems that we're talking about. And how can we not trade off people for commodities? How can we not trade off the people who are most food insecure and probably the most susceptible to climate change to the needs of the developed world, who are concerned about hunger for themselves sometimes, mostly, and the solutions are directed towards solutions for the developed world not to be hungry. When most of the hunger, obviously, is not in the developed world. It is there because of economic and social conditions that we have. But it's not there because we, in the same way that it's there for the billions of farmers that are, really 70% of, I guess, farmers are in developing countries, I would say, and they are the largest portion of the hungry people in the world, but the people who actually produce food. And the fisher folk as well. I'd like to, you know, we can't separate food into compartments. So, organic is actually not a label in the grocery store, in the Whole Foods market. That, I mean, here in the United States, that's, you know, where we see it mostly. I went through the farmers market at the university on the way here, and there were, you know, those same kind of labels, and of course we've regulated and bureaucratized organic, and I will take some responsibility for that as well, both for the International Federation and here in the United States. But what organic really is about farming systems. And the methods that we are using organic are applicable in almost every geographic and environmental situation because they are meant to be adjusted to that farm's soil, that farm's geography, that farm's climate conditions. And it's a relationship between the farmer, the climate, and the soil. That is what organic is all about. And so the methods of organic are being used in many countries around the world. We have, in over 100 countries, we have organizational members of our international federation. There's 1.8 billion organic farmers in the world today. About a third certified organic farmers. And those are, about a third of them are in the least developed countries of the world. 2/3 of them are in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they are applying these principles, these practices, to their own farm situation. Now, many of them were introduced to organic because there was a developed country market for it, especially the certified organic, the market-driven organic programs. And so they are growing export products, cocoa, coffee, and grapes, which are three of the non-commodity crops that are the largest grown organically around the world. And of course they're consumed here in the U.S. and in the European Union. But in addition to that, those farmers on their own farms, in their family plots, in their community plots, have also adopted those practices for food that they grow for themselves. And they've taken that then to communities, regions, and countrywide, where they have asked for government support to help them learn, develop capacity with these new practices. And I think that some of the solutions are in research. We need research for methods and materials that work on small farms and large farms that don't require reliance on large corporations to provide these inputs. And that will work and be adaptable to no matter whatever climate changes come down the road. That you don't have to buy either weed resistance or pest resistance, or you drain your soil of its fertility by using whatever new methods come about to solve problems. So we need more research that's looking at this holistic, level of farming. And that research, if it applies to organic, then it can apply to any agriculture. But research that's done for industrialized agriculture, or very high intensive input agriculture, can't work for organic farmers, and it can't even work for small farmers that are just using traditional methods. So one of the things I'd like to see out of some of the solutions is a redirecting of research, both by corporations, by governments, by the international organizations and research institutes, to say, when we think about sustainability, we're not thinking about a new single solution. We're trying to think about, put the farmer first, think about what they need, especially the farmers that are the most food insecure and most susceptible to both economic, environmental changes that are coming down the line.
And Hans, I mean, you've worked in Africa, and I'm wondering, you know, in our milieu, it's like we see such a polarization of this debate between different approaches. But for a farmer, say in Kenya, I mean, are they even aware of this debate, or is it simply what is the practical solution that works for my, situation? In other words, how does the debate sort of filter down to the practical level?
Well, there's a lot of debate and polarization. Well, just take Kenya, for example. I mean, a lot of the research is done by the National Ag Research, CARI, the Kenya Agricultural Research Institute. They have a large program on BT maize. They have on sweet potato, genetic modified sweet potato, bananas. And I mean, millions have been plowed into this research. A lot of scientists have been actually taken away from other programs to go into this biotech, genetic engineering. But the result is basically zero today. I mean, they haven't come up with anything useful, while there's a lot of problems out there still remaining, and other solutions actually had been researched by a number of international institutions, which could have been actually through local adaptation, which is actually the role of those national research systems, to bring to the farmers. So actually farmers are very much aware also of what's going on, because they get the visits of all kinds of different people. So you get the organic people, you get the Monsanto people are out there, Syngenta and others. So there is this polarization, which is quite strong. Actually, for a while there were even billboards around. You could see, that if head of state don't really agree or accept the genetically modified crops, they will be responsible for a famine which will be coming. So I mean, it has gone very, very far in trying to sort of bend the public opinion that the solution lies in GMOs. We're not saying that somewhere down the road they'll be useful here or there, but I think to me we have to look at what is the problem. We need to start to address the cause of the problem. Why are yields low? Why is the quality of a lot of the crops not good enough? Why do we have these aflatoxins, for example, a huge problem in Africa, in many places with corn. So I think we have to start to address the cause. I mean, because GM crops address only the symptom. Like using pesticides addresses the symptom. It's not the problem lies somewhere else. And I think that's where, to me, the research should concentrate more on figuring out, all right, we got a problem, so how can we deal with it from the cause? If not, we are doing disservice to the farmers and to the consumer in the end, because it's a permanent trying again something new. I mean, with pesticides, we got into this treadmill until we almost had no more solutions. And then GMO came, and now we're doing the same thing again. Sort of, we are not very good in learning from past experience. And so again, instead of learning from this and then going back, it's okay, now we have done all these experiences already. Can we do something different? And again, we know a lot of what could be done different, without polarizing all the issue. And I think that's where I think we need more effort. And that's why also if the farmers are taken much more into the research process, things would look different. Because right now it's a lot of top-down. Oh, we've got the solution, being it from any side of the spectrum of research. Because even for organic, I think it's important that the farmers are taken much more in the process also. So that is one thing which has been lacking a lot, is this more participatory research, finding out from the farmers what is their problem, how can it be solved, and taking them into the loop so that their own experience also can be shared with other farmers. So I think we have to reinvent the paradigm of making research more relevant